All right, we're going to build the most basic modal we can for a simple terms of service link. This is all dummy content, but in my experience, the simplest need for a modal in any application I've ever built is just showing terms of service in a pop-up dialog when somebody clicks it on a sign-up page. So let's look at the app. Here's our welcome.blade.php. This is the HTML file that the browser is loading. It's really simple. The only thing you need to know here is I'm including Tailwind as this little CDN just for development purposes. This screencast course is going to use Tailwind. If you're not familiar with it, go check it out. If you use one of Laravel's starter kits to create your project, it comes shipped with Tailwind. Otherwise, it's pretty easy to install. So I have this Livewire component called signup, and signup really is nothing. This is just a hollow shell. Let's look at the Blade view, signup.blade.php. This is just a bunch of boilerplate HTML with Tailwind. Let's start your journey, sign up for a new component just to get this on the page. What we care about is this terms of service button. This whole episode is just going to center around this piece of HTML because we want this to actually open a modal. So how do we build a modal? This is a complicated topic, and there's a lot of do's and don'ts and pitfalls for something that's seemingly simple. It seems like you should be able to just hit this button and show a div that shows your content, but it's way deeper than that. So deep, in fact, that I would caution you in general against using modals if you can. This is a scenario where I think I want to see a modal, but you could still have a user click this and open up the terms of service in a separate tab, or take them to the terms of service page, or show it in line. There's all sorts of things you can do to avoid using modals. There's even people who've created websites called like don't use modals and all the alternatives you should use instead. So with that caution out of the way, let's actually build a modal. So there is actually an element inside browsers now. It's supported in most modern, actually all modern browsers, called dialog, where you can just put some content. So let's say some content here. And if we load the page, we're not going to see some content because it's in this dialog element. If you add the open attribute, it will now be open. But that's not actually the best way to open this dialog. That just shows it on the page. If you use JavaScript to open the dialog, let me show you this. So if I'm in the DevTools and I hit this arrow and let's click on this button, we'll find dialog right here, some content. Let's open this with JavaScript, $0 to get that element, show modal. Okay, so now it does something a lot different. Instead of just showing a dialog, it turns it into a modal, which means it consumes the whole page and does all sorts of interesting things that are pretty hard to do on your own. For example, autofocus. If you have like an input in here that's autofocused, it will get autofocused when it's shown. Focus, like if you hit tab, it's not going to focus other elements on the page. It's only going to focus what's inside your dialog. And that stuff is really hard to do on your own. So it's not that hard to actually style this dialog element using Tailwind. You could say BG white, give it some padding, make it rounded, add a shadow, and you can even customize the color of the backdrop. You could say like backdrop, BG gray 500, and then half opacity. And let's just see what that looks like now. Oh, we got to open it with JavaScript again. So let's go ahead and get that dialog element right here. Okay. And then open it. And there we go. It actually looks like a decent modal. And it has, again, all those features that are really hard to build on your own. You can hit escape and it'll close it. So it's pretty nice. You could easily wrap this up in some Alpine JS to, when you click this button to get this element and then call show modal on it. But let me tell you why I'm not sure if you should use it, because it takes a lot of customization to do things you want. Let me show you an example. If we fill this some content with all of our terms of service, so the actual content of the terms of service, let's open up that modal one more time. Let's check this out. We got to get that dialog. It's kind of annoying. Sorry. Get the dialog, then hit show modal. Okay. Notice this. There's a few things that I don't like about this. One, you can actually scroll the background, and that's not ideal. In general, you want to disable scrolling in the background, but also it puts it inside this container where the modal is scrollable. It doesn't really let you have a modal that is full size and then you scroll the modal. So this is kind of weird behavior. It's not ideal. And to make it do everything you want to do, like adding animations for the modal to come in and come out, and hijacking scroll or disabling scroll on the body, there's so many things where this starts to break down. But I wanted to mention it because you're going to get a lot out of the box for free if you just use a dialog element. So go for it if that's what you want. But we're not going to do that. So what are we going to do? Well, we could hand roll our own modal with Alpine, and let me just show you very simply how you could do that. Let's wrap this in a div and make this an Alpine component. And we could say open is equal to false. Okay, and then we have this button, and we could say x on clicks. When we click this button, set open equal to true. And then we'll make a div here, and this is going to be our modal. We'll say x show open. Okay, and then inside here we can do all of our Tailwind for an overlay, like fixed, inset 0 to make it full width, flex, justify. There's so many things you could do to make this. Let's actually do it. Justify center, items center, and this is going to center all the contents. And then here we can have our div that's actually like BG white, rounded XL, shadow XL, or whatever you want to do, and P8. And now in here, let's just say some content. And let's see if this worked. I'm kind of just shooting from the hip here. And let's hit terms of service. And there we go. We haven't added a backdrop. I mean, it's not hard to do that. BG gray 550. Okay, and let's see that. All right, so we have a modal, and this looks pretty much the same as it did before. And we're not going to have that like content issue where if we have all the terms of service that it won't be scrollable, but we lost all the other accessibility things that dialog gave us. Now if we tab, we're tabbing through our page, which is not what we want. Autofocus isn't going to work. It's still not like disabling the scroll on the parent container there. The list goes on and on. It's not accessible to make it accessible. You have to have things like aria modal true, or like role equals, I forget. Like you have to know all this stuff. Maybe it's aria dialog, who knows? But you have to have like role, dialog, maybe, whatever. I'm not going to sit here and guess them all, but you have to have a bunch of accessibility attributes. And then again, all that stuff I just mentioned, scroll hijacking and focus trapping, all that is really hard to build. So what is the answer here? I think the answer is I'm going to build it for you, and you can just copy it out of this course and use it in your own apps, because I think that's really the move here. So I'm going to show you the way that I'm not going to actually build it out for you. I'm just going to paste it in this page so that we have a launching point for this course. And this is going to be the bedrock. You can take this modal and bring it to any application you want with you, and you'll just know that it's reliable and handles all those things. So there's one thing we need to do before we build out that modal. We need to include a CDN for Alpine's UI package. You don't have to really know what this is. I'm going to tell you a secret. Here's the secret. If you go to Alpine's docs and then you access the components inside Alpine's docs, apparently my internet's slow right now. There are components and they cost money, but I'm going to give you one for free. So if we actually go to the dialog modal component, why is my internet so slow? I'm so sorry. If we go to the modal component, we have a modal built for us. And really, I'm just copying and pasting all the code that's required. So this is a paid component that normally you have to pay for, but I'm just going to give it to you for free so that we can get up and running with this series. So again, go to the code for this course, copy this snippet and include this in your application, preferably in the head. If you do exactly this in your application, you'll be good to go. Now we can actually use that modal. All right, instead of drawing it all out for you, we're just going to paste it in. Modal robust. Okay. So this is the full modal that does everything we want. And you don't have to understand everything about it, but let me just show you that it's very similar to the basic modal we created earlier. We have xData open is false, onClick open is true, and then here's the modal. There's some special things like xDialog. This gives us all the accessibility stuff. But we have xModel open to toggle that open and closed, and a few other things. An overlay is built for us. The panel is built for us. A close button is built for us. And all we need to do is pop our button here, this terms of service. We're going to put it inside this little button placeholder here. Okay, and let's load this on the page and see what happens. If I click terms of service, there we go. We have a nice modal with nice animations. If I tab, tabbing is locked. It's not going to tab the page behind. I can't scroll the page behind. I'll show you that if I open DevTools. You can't scroll the page behind, which is exactly what we want. So this answers all our questions, solves all our problems. Let's actually put the terms of service into this content here. And now we hit terms of service and check that out. We got our terms of service. We can scroll that content. We can hit escape to exit it. We can hit this X to exit it. It fades in and out really nicely. And this is basically exactly what you want for a situation like this. So that's going to be our launching point. This is our modal that we built. In the next episode, we're going to extract it into a reusable blade component so that we can use this in a bunch of different places in our project and not have to write out this whole bit or copy and paste it, blah, blah, blah. So I'll see you in the next video. All right, we have our modal from the last video, but as you saw, the HTML is just verbose. And if we want to reuse this modal in different parts of our app, we don't want to copy and paste everything. So we're going to extract a blade component to make this reusable. Now let me first say, you might be tempted to extract a Livewire component called modal, and I'm going to say, pause. Do not do that. Maybe eventually you would need something like that, but this is so much more involved than extracting a blade component. In general, when I'm extracting reusable bits of UI like a modal or a dropdown or a custom input or a button or anything like that, stick with blade components because they're a lot simpler. When you start nesting Livewire components, you have to know a bunch of the ins and outs and the pitfalls, and there's all sorts of little barriers. So I would say, if you can, just extract a reusable blade component. So let me show you what that looks like. Before we even do anything, let's write out what we're going to end up with. So what we're going to end up with is xmodal. This is going to be our blade component. And there's a few things we can do. Blade components have slots, so we could say xslot button, and then put the button inside that slot. But personally, the slots are a great way to start with a blade component, but when I'm building out like robust components, I actually end up just creating nested new blade components for parts of a blade component. So this is called composition, when you compose something with other things. So instead of using slots, I'm going to create another component called xmodal.button. Okay, and then we'll close that. So we're going to have xmodal.button, and then we'll have xmodal.panel. Okay, and then inside of here, we'll put like our button right here. So here's button. And we can get rid of this X on click. We don't actually need it. We didn't need it before. It was just left over from before. So that's that. And then the panel, we can extract everything from inside this content. So here's our panel. Let's do this. We'll get all these contents here. And then we will paste it into panel. And there we go. Okay, so this is pretty much what we want to end up with. This is my ideal usage. So then you can carry this xmodal component around with you anywhere in your application, and it's really readable. It's really nice. You can put anything you want in panel. You can have any button you want inside of button, and you're good to go. So let's actually build this out. First thing, we're going to have to create a blade component. You can do that with Artisan. You can say artisan make component, and then we could say modal or modal.button and say view, and then it'll create an anonymous blade component. I'm going to skip that part, and we're going to make them by hand. So that's, well, you know what, whatever. I already wrote that out. Nope, it's not in my history. We're just going to create a new folder called components, because this is where Laravel is going to look for blade components to automatically load them anyway. And now we could create, for our modal, we could create modal.blade.php. And then when we reference that, it's going to reference this file. But I want to actually show you a different pattern that I like for composable components like this. So inside components, we're going to create a new folder called modal. And now all of our modal components are going to be stored inside this folder. So it's really clean in our application. So there's a pattern we can use where if you name an index.blade file, this is going to be used for the root modal component. So let's just create that root first, and then we'll create button and panel. Actually, let's just create the button and panel now, and then we'll fill them up in a minute. So button.blade.baldy.php, okay? And then here, let's say panel.blade.php. All right, so there are our three files that are created. We're going to start with index.blade.php, and then we'll fill out the rest. So for index, let's take this root div here. So div xdata. Maybe the smartest thing to do here is take all of it and paste it in, and then we'll extract bits out as we go so that you don't have to hop back and forth between too many files too much. Okay, so this is good, but all of this trigger, this is going to end up inside button. So let's put it inside button right here. And then this whole contents here, this modal part, this is going to end up inside panel. Okay. All right, and then we can get rid of this. And we'll fill this out in a second, but just so you have an idea, our index is just the shell. That's going to be what renders with modal. Our button is going to be, oops, let me show you here. Okay, our button is going to be what's modal button, and then our panel is all of the modal panel and all of that stuff. Okay, so one thing we're missing here is how does this content get rendered inside here? How does this content get rendered inside here? And that's where slots come in. When you put content in between an opening and closing blade component tag, that's considered a slot. And you can push it in just like this. You render out a variable called slot, and then it's just going to be rendered here. So with this, now both of these are going to show up inside slot. So let's go another layer deeper. Let's go into the button. Whoops. We're going to go into the button here, and let's just echo out the slot contents. And now all of this is going to be echoed out right here. Okay, and then let's go into panel. We're almost done with the slots. Scroll down, and here's our panel contents. And let's put that inside slot, just like this. So now we're forwarding all the slots. So just to remind you the flow, when we call xmodal, Laravel is going to look for a modal folder with an index file. It's going to render it, and then when it sees slot, it's going to take all of these contents and render it inside slot. When it goes to render the contents, it goes, okay, xmodal button, that's a separate blade component. Whoops. Separate blade component, load that up. Oh, there's a slot here. Render what's passed in between the files and put them here. Okay, and this is going to end up the same as where we started, except now when you're using it, it's much cleaner and it gives you a lot more power that we're going to explore in a minute. So let's just render it on the page. Fingers crossed that this all works. Refresh, hit terms of service, and there we go. And just to remind you, we did a lot of extracting, but if you view the page source, you don't see any of that. You just see your div with your X data, you see your button just like before, and you see your dialog and your panel and everything like that. But now this is really clean and reusable. I like it a lot. And because we extracted into these nested components, we could create any sort of components we want for our modal and allow developers to use them however they want. So for example, let's say we want to make a close button. No problem. Inside here, let's copy the contents of button, put it inside close button, and set open equal to false. Okay, so now we have a close button. If we want, maybe at the bottom here, we could just say xmodal.close button, close that tag. And in these contents, let's take this register button. We'll just copy register, we'll paste it here, and instead of saying register, we'll say cancel. Okay, now when we load up our modal and we scroll to the bottom, we have this cancel button that we can click and it'll close the modal. And the user, the person using or consuming this component, they don't have to know to set open equal to false. They don't have to know anything about the internals. That's how I like to architect my blade components, so that when you're using them, everything, it's almost like they're their own independent product and you don't have to know the internals of them. They encapsulate all of those details inside themselves and give you affordances. They give you these little hooks or these components that you can use for specific use cases. Okay. So we're doing good with extracting the blade component. Let me show you a few more advanced things. This is great for something like terms of service, but there are times where you might want to control this modal from the Livewire component itself. So let me show you that. Let's open up our sign up Livewire component and create a public property called show modal. We'll set it to false by default. Okay, and then let's create a new method called open modal, and we'll set show modal to true. Okay, now how do we'll make a button to call open modal first and then we'll talk about it. So let's make a button. It could be anywhere, it doesn't matter. We're going to say open modal from Livewire, wire click, open modal. All right, standard Livewire stuff. This is going to run this method and set show modal from false to show modal equals true. Now right now this isn't going to do anything. If we click open modal from Livewire, nothing happens. If we look in the dev tools, we see that a network request is sent. So we know that Livewire is working, but let's actually open the modal with this. How do we wire this up? Well, In my dream world, you would just do something like this. Wire model, show modal, just as if it were a normal text input, and it would magically just work. Well, we're gonna make it magically work. Let me show you how we're gonna do that. There's a little more of advanced stuff here, but that's okay, because again, you can just copy this into your app. You don't have to build this yourself. Just take my Blade components. Okay, X modal, wire model. So we passed wire model show modal into here. I'm so sorry that you have to hear model and modal right next to each other. But let's take a look here. Okay, we'll look at page source. Scroll down, and here's our HTML. Here's our root div xdata open false, but wire model is not on it. So we attached it here, but it didn't get forwarded. So anything you add extra into a Blade component, any of these HTML attributes, they just get disintegrated into thin air unless you do something with them. Let's take the attributes and forward them onto this element. This is a really nice feature because it gives you the full power over when extra attributes are added to a component. Where do you want to put them? And you can put them anywhere. And Laravel will handle all of that for you. And you can even do advanced stuff like where starts with. I believe that's it. And then you could say like wire model so that you're only forwarding wire model attributes, and you could forward classes to a separate element. There's so many things that you could do. But for now, we're just going to forward all the attributes. And let's just refresh this source. So let's take a look at this right here. This is what we care about. We refresh the source and look at that. Now our wire model has been forwarded onto this div. Now it's still not going to work because we just have wire model next to xdata. That doesn't mean anything. We want to make it so that open changes when show modal changes. And here's a little piece of API that I added to Alpine to make this exact use case a delight. It's called xmodelable. It's an Alpine directive where you can basically say, next to your xdata, you could say xmodelable and pass in the name of a piece of data. And now Alpine will allow you to add xmodel something else. And now this will be bound to this. Or it also works with wire model. You can add wire model whatever, and it's going to make sure that if whatever changes, this changes. And it also works the other way around. If this changes internally, this is going to change. So it's a little bit that we have to add. I understand it's definitely a confusing feature, but I'm telling you, it is so much better than all of the alternatives. And if you just stretch your brain or open up the docs or even just ignore what I'm saying and copy and paste from what I did, it's going to make your life so nice because you can make these Blade components and just easily wire model to them as if they're normal input elements. So let's reload it. And now we see xdata, xmodelable, wire model, show model. And just to remind you what that is, before this was an encapsulated xdata open. And so everything just relied on open. Then we added wire model, and that we didn't connect these two dots. Xmodelable is the bridge between them, saying, hey, take open and bind it to show modal so that anytime it's changed, change both. Okay, let's see it in action. Now we have just a normal Livewire wire click. So open modal from Livewire, and now it works. Hit escape, and we're good to go. So yeah, we have a nice modal component now. We can wire model to it and interact with Livewire, do whatever we want. Use it anywhere in our application, and it's going to work beautifully. We're going to dig into all sorts of more complex use cases for modals, especially when you're using them with Livewire, if you're adding forms into modals or whatever. We're going to dig into all that, but this is a good starting point. See you in the next video. All right, let's talk about modals that actually do stuff. So a confirmation modal seems to be like the simplest place to start. If you have a dangerous action like delete, so here I have a list of just kind of dummy blog posts. If you have this little delete button, right now it does nothing, but we'll wire it up to do something. And generally with a dangerous action like this, you want to show some sort of confirmation dialogue to your users so that they don't just accidentally click and destroy their sweet, sweet blog post. So let's take a look at the Livewire component. So there's a component called show posts, returns a Blade view, passes in posts from the database. And let's take a look at show posts. Blade. Now this is just a bunch of HTML and Tailwind boilerplate, and I'm looping through the posts here and showing a title, some content, and then a delete button that currently does nothing. So let's wire up the delete button to actually do the deleting. We'll add a wire click here, wire click, delete. We'll pass the post ID, post ID, post if. We pass the post ID, and now let's make a little delete method in our Livewire component that accepts a post ID. And then here we'll get that out of the database, post find post ID. Okay, and then we can delete the post. So one quick note, I'm gonna make this 1,000 times in these screencasts. When you call a method from the front end with wire click, it's not protected. A malicious user can open up their DevTools and change this post ID to whatever they want. So this input that you're getting here, you have to treat as user input. It's untrusted. You have to do your authorization and your validation and anything you need to do. In this case, these are just dummy posts. There's no user model in this app at all. But generally, if you're showing posts, you're showing a user's post, and you want to make sure that user can delete that post. So just a security note there. But we got our delete method. We got our wire click. Let's see it in action. We hit delete, and perfect. It works just like we want. But now we want to add a confirmation for the user. Simplest way to do this is actually without a modal at all. There's this tool in Livewire called wire confirm, where let's say, are you sure you want to delete this post? Okay, just add wire confirm and a message to any action, wire click, whatever. And now when that action is about to be performed, it shows a little dialog up here. Are you sure you want to delete this post? You can cancel and nothing will happen, or you can hit OK and it'll do the action that it held up in the first place. So let me say full stop. This is the best way to do what we're doing. Don't watch anymore if you're actually just concerned about showing a delete confirmation. That is the best way to do it, in my opinion. If you think that this looks tacky or unprofessional, go to GitHub. There's actions like just the other day, I was just doing something on GitHub and it showed me a dialog just like this that I could confirm or not. It doesn't mean you're a novice. It's really just taking advantage of built-in tools inside the browser. This is accessible. It works on mobile. It's perfect. It doesn't add any extra HTML to your payload. It doesn't slow down your app. This is the way. Did you hear me? This is the way. But for demonstration purposes and times where you're not just doing a simple confirmation, I'm going to actually show you how to build up a confirmation modal from scratch. We'll make it complicated. We'll add in text confirmation so they can type confirm. We'll do all that stuff. And yeah, so that's that. All right, let's get rid of wire confirm and let's wire up our own modal. So public service announcement, I've been using the word modal when I mean modal dialogue. It's really kind of annoying, but technically, these are dialogues that are like modal, like I get like there's dialogues that aren't modals and there's whatever. I don't fully understand it, but I'll tell you this. If you were to go to the worldwide, whatever, to like accessibility standards for the web, they're not really going to use the word modal very much. They're going to use the word dialogue or modal dialogue. And if you noticed inside our modal component, which I ended up renaming to dialogue, but just take a look at this. Inside of, where is it? Inside panel, there's X dialogue because it's not modal. The tool is called a dialogue. So I decided to just take the liberty and rename our modal components to just dialogue components to be more consistent. And you'll see why a little later why I think this is a good rename. So that said, I didn't want to re-record the entire course, so it's now dialogue. I hope you're not confused by that. All right, X dialogue, dialogue button, panel. This button, let's put as our delete button inside our dialogue. We can get rid of wire click delete now because this button is just triggering the dialogue to open. And then inside panel, we'll put some content. And I already have some here, confirm panel. This is a bunch of HTML so that you don't have to see me write it all. Are you sure this? Well, I'll show you what it looks like in a sec. We hit delete now, and now it shows our nice little modal. Are you sure? This operation is permanent, can't be reversed. This post will be deleted forever. Our X works, everything about our modals just works, but these buttons don't do anything yet. So let's make them do stuff. Before we actually make them do stuff, I want to show you a nice little optimization. I added this footer to this modal because often you have a footer in a modal when you have buttons, and I don't want you to have to style this yourself for every time you want a footer. So I think this is a good opportunity to extract a new Blade component called footer. So footer.blade.php. And now let's extract these two lines here. We'll extract these two lines. I'm sorry about this indentation. This is definitely annoying for screencasting. And then we'll just pump out a slot here. Okay. And now we can get rid of these two and do X dialog.footer. And then we'll close that here, x dialog.footer. Now this looks a lot cleaner, and we re-render and everything is the same, but cancel doesn't do anything. No problem, we can make it do something. We already created another component in the last video or 2 videos ago called, what was it called? Close button. So that if we want a button to just be a close button, no problem. We just add this or wrap it in this xdialog close button. So now cancel should work. Let's try it. We go to delete, cancel works. Okay. And now our delete button, this is pretty simple. It's basically as simple as wire click, delete, just like we had before, right? Well, there's one caveat here that this is kind of an annoying problem. We cancel, that works, but if I hit delete, it deletes, but it doesn't close the modal. Because this whatever, oh, I hate that I'm using those words interchangeably. This dialog here has a variable called open inside of it. Remember xdata open? Its open state is kept internally. And right here, we want to change its open state to false. And we've done this in the past. I showed you how you can add wire model and keep a variable called like show modal or something in show posts. But this isn't going to work this time because if you think about it, there's this dialog. There's however many posts you have on the page, there's dialogues. Each row has its own dialogue. So they can't all depend on one global variable. There's a bunch of different ways to do this, but I'm going to show you the most pragmatic way that's going to avoid so much complexity. There's lots of fancy things you could do to achieve this, but I'm going to show you what I think is just the most practical. Before we do this, I'm going to magically refresh this list of posts right now, so that we have more posts that we can go ahead and delete. So easiest thing to do here, just wrap it in the close button. You're not going to find an easier way to do this. Wrap it in the close button. And now what's going to happen is Livewire is going to pick up this delete. It's going to call deletion, but then right after this click happens, this close button is going to pick up that click because click events, they cascade or they bubble up. So it's going to both delete the post and it's also going to close the modal, and I'll show you what that looks like. It looks like really good. Are you sure? Yes. And then it did it. It closed the modal and it deleted it, and it saved us from a lot of extra pain. But there's one little tiny thing if you care a lot, and let me show you what that is. If we go into show posts, and let's just say that this deletion takes a second, like it takes 1 second to actually delete from the database. Now when we go to delete it, it's going to close the modal right away while the delete is happening on the back end and waiting for Livewire to refresh. This really isn't a problem. In fact, there's a lot of things you could do, like there's wire loading with Livewire to make this table kind of opaque, like make it a little transparent while it's loading and disable everything to just show users that something is going on. And that's actually what I would recommend, is just leave it the way it is, because often actions aren't going to take a full second. Just leave it the way it is. But we're here to teach you stuff. So let me show you a more, advanced way of doing this. I'm not necessarily recommending it, but I want to show you because Livewire is pretty powerful once you understand the advanced stuff. So wire click, well, it's powerful anyway, but yeah, you know what I'm saying. Instead of using Livewire to call this delete method, let's use Alpine. X on click, wire.delete. This is the equivalent of wire click delete. I don't know if you have seen videos about this or whatever, but $wire is something that's available inside Alpine in your Livewire components, and it's crazy powerful. Let me show you how even more powerful it is. If you're familiar with JavaScript's await syntax, you can actually use it with this method. You can say await, hold up JavaScript execution. While this is being called, this is going to wait until it comes back from the server, and then we can execute another bit of code over here. And to show you what kind of code I want to execute, if we go inside the dialog panel and take a look at the stock close button, this is the one that comes with all our modals. If you look at how it actually works, X on click, dialog.close. Okay, that's an internal thing that xdialog provides us, and pretty much the reason that I decided we need to rename everything to dialog so that this part doesn't look weird. So watch this, we just do dialog.close. So reminder what's happening, Alpine is going to hear the click on the delete button. It's going to wait for it to actually call Livewire and do the deleting. Then it's going to close the modal. So check this out. Let's see it in action. The taste of coffee. delete. Now we press delete, and it's going to hold and wait until it's done and then close. There's lots of other things we should do, like wrap this in a little form element and have it disable the input while it's deleting, but we're not going to go crazy with this stuff. So I think what I'm going to do is go back to the olden days where we just had the simple close button and wire click delete, because honestly, I think this is what I would probably do in an application myself. All right, we're getting more advanced. Things are good, but let's add a little curveball or another thing you might want, an input confirmation. So check this out. If you go to delete, you might want to force a user to type something like confirm into the dialog or into this input before they can actually do the deletion. And this is pretty easy because we're using Alpine. Let's just create a little Alpine component in our panel. We'll say X data confirmation and set this to an empty string. Now our input X model confirmation. If you're not familiar with Alpine, that's going to make any input in this input element here, it's going to bind it with the data that you pass. So X data confirmation is always going to be coupled with the value of this input. So now we can do stuff. We could say set the disabled attribute on this button to only show if the confirmation is equal to confirm. I know I typed the opposite of what I just said, but you get it. So let's just look at it in action. We hit delete. This is disabled. We can't click it. We type confirm. Now it's enabled. We can hit delete and it deletes our post. We still have that sleep 1 on, which makes it look a little janky. Yeah, I guess let's take a second and actually make this look a little bit better. On our table in T-body, like what would happen if we did this? Opacity 50. Okay, it's going to make it all look opaque, right? And that maybe kind of makes it look like it's in a loading state, which is pretty good. And maybe we'll do, yeah, there's a few different ways we could go about this. We could put BG white. Let's just leave it. We'll just take care of this. Opacity 50. If we want to apply this class only when Livewire is loading, we can do that with this. Wire loading.class opacity 50. Now if we go to delete one of these, we type confirm. It's going to take a second, but everything should be in kind of a loading state. And there it is, because we did that bit of wire loading. Now it looks beautiful. It doesn't look janky. Janky things are when things just are happening seemingly out of nowhere or in odd timing. But when you show a user some sort of loading state, everything feels solid. You feel like you trust the app because it's keeping track of what's pending and not. So I think it's really important to add wire loading to basically just show your users anytime you're loading something, disabling buttons, showing loading spinners, disabling tables, whatever you got to do. So that's it. I think that's the most advanced thing we can do here, and I'm pretty happy with it. So that's confirmation modals. Again, just use wire confirm. I'll see you in the next video. All right, we're going to wire up this button here, this new post button, to show a modal that's got a form inside of it, so we can submit a new post in a modal and close the modal after and validate and yada, yada, yada. Let's do it. So in our show posts blade view, here's this button, this new post button that currently does nothing. Let's make it open a modal. So we'll do what we've been doing. We have our dialog blade component here. Put that there. Okay, so now we have in the button, we have this new post. And if we reload the page, we should have a modal when we hit new post, and we do. All right, so let's fill this with a form. I have a bunch of boilerplate here, and so pretty simple. I don't even have a form tag. I wanted to just keep it as boilerplatey as possible. So it's just a div with some text and then 2 input elements, title and content. So let's look at that. Okay, we have our form. We have some sample validation, styling, and the inputs. Let's add the 2 buttons. So I'm going to steal that footer that we used in our delete modal. So we'll take that footer, put it right here. Okay, and we don't want any of this stuff. Whoops, so let's get rid of this. We'll leave type button, and we don't want red this time. We want blue for the confirmation. So this is gonna say, and it also says delete right now. We'll say save for add a new post, I guess. And then the cancel button is fine. So let's see what that looks like. Okay, we have cancel, and we have save, which does nothing. Let's also get rid of this close button because we're not going to need that for this form. So if we hit save, it should just do nothing, and then cancel will cancel. Okay. We have this div. Let's turn this into a form tag. And now we can actually do something. Of course, we're going to add wire submit and do all that stuff. We'll get there in a second, but I want to show you one really crazy thing that boggled my mind on this screencast for so long. And it's so stupid. And I've told you this before, but this type button, it's so important to add type button to buttons that aren't submit buttons. So this one is actually going to be a submit button inside of a form tag. But just so you understand how this works, if there's no type on a button, the browser assumes it's a submit button. And when it's pressed, if there's a form tag above it, it will submit that form. So if it's a submit button, I just say, just anytime you have a button, always add a type. This is a submit button. When we press it, it's going to submit this form. This is a close button, but it doesn't have a type on it. So if you leave this type out, check out this crazy thing that happens. If I just hit enter in this title field, it closes the dialog. What's happening here? Why is that happening? When I press the enter key on this input, it triggers a submission by looking for the first button inside of the form tag, which is this button, and then it fakes a press, which I guess also translates into a click, which gets caught here and sets open to fall. Oh my gosh, this took me so long. So I just wanted to hammer this home, because if this took me a while to figure it out, and I freaking made the thing, so it definitely could catch you up. So add your type buttons. Okay, so we have type button. Now it's just going to work as expected. We hit enter in title and nothing. Oh my gosh, it did something. I don't know why it did that thing, because it hit submit. Oh, you know what it did? It actually submitted the full form because we're not using Livewire with the form yet. So, okay, that's what we would expect. All right, so we have our form. Let's wire it up in the back end. I'm going to go to back end mode for a second, and then we'll go back into front end mode in a minute. But right now we have this delete function. Let's make a new function called add. And then here is where we're going to, you would think to do something like this. Post create, like this, validate, post create, and then inside here, title, and then this title, and then content, this content, and then create two public variables called title, maybe set it to an empty string, and then this is content, empty string, and then wire model to this title and content, and then make your form submission, call this add. So this is like Livewire 101 when you're making a form in Livewire. And this is fine, but I don't quite love it because we have a show posts component here, and it's we have this, all of this stuff has to do just with that add post modal, which I don't love, because maybe we'll have edit post modals in each row, and then we're going to need new properties and new methods for that, and it's just going to feel like it gets out of hand. These are scenarios where you might think to nest the component, to create a nested add post component, and we might do that in the next screencast, but that's a lot of extra. Again, in general, I say start by don't reach for nesting Livewire components right away. Don't just reach to create this, because I've warned you before, there's lots of ins and outs with nested Livewire components. You have to deal with communicating back and forth that a new post was added, so now you can refresh the list. It's just whatever. So for these cases, there's a new nice little abstraction in Livewire 3 called form objects. So let's create a form object, artisan Livewire form, and this is going to be create post form. Okay, so it just created our create post form, and just to show you where this lives, it's in app Livewire forms create post. And now in here, let me open that in a separate window. Okay, so here you can actually take all of this and put it inside. So now this has the title property, this has content, and this has our add method. Let's turn this into a save method. We need to import post, that post model, so app models post, okay? And there we go. So now we're validating inside here. We're creating the post inside here. This feels really good to me. And then here we could say public create post, import that, and we'll just call this form, okay? Because we know it's a form object. We're still going to need a method on this root here to call from our form. So we'll say save, and then we can just forward that. This form arrow save. And let's actually call this add so that they're different names. I kind of like that. Like this parent, this show posts has an add button. So that should be kind of mapped to the add method. It has a delete button that's mapped to delete. And then this create post, I don't know, you can name it whatever you want, but we're just kind of forwarding the logic. We're basically deferring everything to do with creating the post into that form object. Okay. So that's form objects. We've wired up the back end. Let's wire up the front end. So we go into our show posts. We deal with our ridiculous level of nesting, unfortunately. And here we have our button panel and there's our form. So here we could say wire submit. And then we're going to call that add method here. And that's going to call form save. And then these inputs, we want to wire model. So we'll do wire model title here. And then text area is going to be wire model content. So now those two fields are wired up. The only thing left is validation. So, well, actually, I just made a mistake. This is probably a common mistake you're going to make. I referenced title, but there's no title property. Title's inside form now. So we have to type form.title and form.content. And it's going to be the same with validation. So for these validation messages, let's do this. Error and form.title. I'll change the other one to content in a second. And then here, instead of just some random placeholder, we'll echo out message. This is just part of Laravel's @error syntax, and then end error. Okay. And so we have form.title. Let's do form.content down here. We have our cancel button and we have our submit button. It's type submit. So when the user presses this button or hits enter on any of these input fields, it's going to turn into a form submission here. Call add our post, and that'll be that. So let's see if it works. Let's hit new post. We'll say some new post, and let's just hit enter right now to see the validation work. Okay, so it didn't work because we didn't add any validation, and it's telling us right now, it's saying show post doesn't have any rules, but we're trying to validate. So let's go inside create post and add some validation. There's a few different ways you could do this. You could say title is this or is like required or something. You can do it inside there, but my preferred method when I can use it, this won't work for every validation case, is these rule objects that come shipped with Livewire. So you can just add that rule attribute above it. We'll just say required, and maybe the title will make minimum 3, and then the post you can have as much or as little content as you want. Okay, so we have some validation now. Let's try this out. We hit new post. Let's just hit enter and see there's our validation, some new post. Hit enter again. We're validating that the content field is required. So we'll say some content. Okay. Now let's hit save. Okay. It saved, but it didn't close our modal and it didn't clear our input, but it did add it as a new row. So we're kind of halfway there. To clear the input, let's do this. We'll just say title equals empty string, or actually, if you'd prefer, you could say reset title and content. And let's make sure that works. So if we hit new post, we add some dummy data, we hit save. Okay, it cleared the input and it added the new post, but we need to close the modal now. And there's a few different ways to do this, but if you recall, I think the cleanest way, if it's a single modal, would be to wire model this entire modal. So wire model, we'll say show add post dialog. Okay. And then here, let's add a public variable called show add post dialog. And this is going to be false by default. And then when you press the open button, that's going to turn to true. Then when we go to submit, after we save, we can close that dialog. And I like doing this in here rather than putting it inside the posts thing, because this is kind of an outside concern. You could reuse create post if you had an entire page dedicated to adding a post, you could use this exact form object and reuse all that logic and validation and not have to worry about this add or this, toggling the modal. That definitely feels like something that's concerned with this component. So show add post dialog, set it back to false after we add the post. And again, if you'd prefer, you can use this reset syntax, and that's going to reset that back to its original value. All right, so let's test this out. Let's see if we're in business. We say some new post, and here's some new post content. Okay, and then we hit that save. It closed, and it added our new post. It's everything we wanted. So this is perfect. This is everything we need in a simple form modal There's one thing that I want to just add really quick, a little like quality of life thing. When you hit new post, it autofocuses the close button because that's the first focusable thing in this modal. Let's instead focus the first input. So if we add autofocus right here, now when we open the post, it autofocuses this title field for us so the user can just start typing, hey there, some content, and then save that, and then we're good to go. Okay, so that's nice. We have a nice, clean, new post modal. It saves our state, of course, because it's just a single post. If the person cancels out and then they go back to, they go, oops, I accidentally hit escape. I hope I don't have to rewrite my post. It's all still there for you. So that's that. I'll see you in the next video. In the last video, we made this new post modal where you can do stuff and validate and do the whole thing. And this is good enough. Like I would say start here. This is one of those times where I'm going to say, hey, just because I'm going to show you a more complicated way of doing something doesn't mean you need to complicate your app. In fact, I think this is a perfectly reasonable setup. Just like I think that delete button should just be a simple confirmation dialog. Probably stick with this. But let me show you one con of this approach and then a way to, again, make it slightly more complex, but solve for that con. With this setup, every time, because this is part of our big Livewire component, anytime this does anything, when we hit a submission, it does a full Livewire request and re-renders the whole component. So let me show you what I'm talking about. If we open up the network tab and we partially fill in this post, and then we do some simple submission with validation. So it doesn't even add the post. It's fine and fast enough, but let's pretend that your component is huge. Ours is actually decent size because we have a modal in each of these rows. There's a lot of markup. When I did that simple form submission and got back a validation error, take a look in the Livewire request. You don't have to know about what we're sending and getting back, but there's this bit of HTML that comes back. This is all the rendered HTML for this component. So again, we did a simple little thing like hit enter to get validation on a single form and show a single bit of validation error. Well, it went back, it re-rendered the whole component, it re-queried all the posts from the database, and it rendered out all of that HTML. Like, it's a lot of HTML, and it won't even show me all the HTML because it's basically all the HTML of this page. So when you get into these scenarios where you want to break up a component into multiple, it can make sense. And I would recommend doing it when you need to save on resources. And you'll see the complexity it adds. It's a trade-off. You're trading off some complexity for a little bit more efficiency. So let's take this whole new post setup and put it in a dedicated Livewire component so that it's an island. If you didn't know that, I'm just going to keep talking about that in these series. Is that plural for series? We're going to keep talking about that, how components are islands. If this is a nested component, when this component re-renders or refreshes, it doesn't re-render this component unless you tell it to. And same thing with this component. If we create this a separate Livewire component, when we do something in here, it's only going to re-render itself. So that's advantageous in certain scenarios. So let's do it. Let's, let's start here. Here's show post. Here's this whole dialog. We're going to take this and put it inside a Livewire component, and we're going to call it add post dialog. That's going to be our component name. And then let's take all of these contents, put them in the clipboard, and this is the Livewire component we're going to create. So artisan make Livewire add post dialog. Okay. And now that just created a new Livewire component called add post dialog for us. And then let's open up that blade view. We're kind of skipping ahead. We're just going to open up the blade view, and I'm going to put all those contents in here. So you'll notice I kept this root div. You can technically do this, but I'm going to caution you against putting complicated things as the root element in a Livewire component. If you have a blade component as the root element, it can just get a little dicey because you don't know what's inside this blade component, what attributes it's adding to the root element. So just in general, if you can help it, just stick with a simple div or a simple wrapping element. Don't make a blade component the root of your component. It's just one less area to make mistakes. Okay, so we have that little bit. Let's open up add post dialog, the actual Livewire component, and then let's open up this show posts not there. Let's open it here, show posts, okay? And we're gonna take a bunch of this and just stick it into here. So this whole form, this show dialog, this add method, all of this can now live inside this component. And we just got to add those import statements as well. Let's add that import that use the create post. Okay, so we've imported everything. We've cleaned up this component so it doesn't care about adding posts at all. And we've shoved all that inside of our add post dialog. One random thing, this doesn't really matter. This says show add post dialog. It feels redundant now. Before that made sense because it was in a show post component. Now it's inside add post dialog. So let's just say show. We could just say show. Let's just leave it as show. I like that. And then we'll go inside add post dialog, that blade view, and instead of show add post, we'll just say show. So I like that. You can use open, you can use show. These are synonyms. Just try to be consistent. I'm not, but maybe you will be. Okay. Show is false, reset show. So we're good. This should actually work. Let's try it out. We hit new post. So this is a nested Livewire component. Let me just show you how you can tell. When you go into your HTML, Livewire components have a bunch of extra stuff that Livewire adds to their root elements. So this is the whole show post component. And now when we get to that button, there it is. It's an entirely separate nested component inside here. Okay, so we hit new post. We say some post. And let's just verify when we do this little just validation that fails validation, it made an update, but it's a lot smaller now. If we look at the HTML that got rendered, it's not actually truncating it for us anymore. It's showing us the full HTML because it's just the HTML that needs to be returned for that modal. You'll see there's the dialog, there's the close button, all that. So it's a lot lighter weight, and we didn't make a whole new database request for the whole parent component. It's pretty nice. So some post, some content, and then we hit save. So we got some post, right? And that's not in our list. We hit save. Okay, everything seemed to work, except it didn't show that new post at the bottom of our table here. Because again, components are islands. That's why I caution you against just nesting Livewire components willy-nilly, because they are islands. We did a whole thing in here, and it didn't impact the outer Livewire component at all. What we need it to do is after it's done adding a new post, we need to tell the parent component to refresh its posts. And there's lots of different ways to do this, but let me show you what I think is the simplest and most elegant. Inside add post dialog, after we actually add the new post and reset the dialog, let's do this. Let's dispatch an event called added. Okay. And now that we have this event, let's go into the show posts. So right here, we're inside our blade view for show posts, add post dialog. We can just listen for that event. So when added, and then you can call any method. We could say, whatever, we could have a method inside this show posts called close, or I don't know, refresh the page or whatever. But there's a magic method in Livewire called $refresh that you've probably seen. You can do it anywhere. If you wanted to add wire click here, $refresh, when you click this button, it'll just refresh the whole page. There's a synonym for it, commit, if you prefer that. But I think refresh is pretty intuitive. So this is nice. We have our nested Livewire component. We're saying, hey, if that component dispatches this added event, refresh our page. And that should be good. This syntax I actually added for this screencast because I was trying to figure out the best way to communicate, and it just felt a little heavy-handed. You could do something like inside add post dialog. There's a few different things you can do. I think you can add event listeners to render methods. Like you could say, added here, or maybe up here, or just create an empty method called added that does nothing and then listen for that event here, like on added. That would work. That would actually do, oh, I'm actually in the wrong, well, pretend that I put all this in the parent show posts component. But again, there's kind of issues with that. I don't like that it lives inside the class, and it would listen for the added event from any Livewire component basically on the page. So this is a way to just say, just listen for that event on this specific component. It's very readable. It's very intuitive. If you're used to Vue.js, you've probably seen it there. So we added that little listener, listen for added, call refresh, and let's just see if that works. We had some post, and now let's say some other post, some content, hit save, and there we go. It did the whole thing. It added the post, it refreshed our page. So there's one con that you should know about. We made another trade-off here. When we add a post, take a look at this. We add some post, and now we hit save. It did 2 network requests. The first one was to create the new post in that Livewire component and then call dispatch. It came back, and in its payload, it said, hey, dispatch the add method or the added event. So it dispatches added. Then this parent listens for that event and then refreshes itself. So this one is just the parent refreshing itself. And on slow, it's normally not an issue. Like you didn't even notice it. But if we were on a really slow connection, we would notice it. If we went to do something and then we hit save, first it's going to take a second and save. Then it's going to take a second and refresh. But again, as long as you show loading states, this can be okay because the user knows that the app is thinking. It's not just being janky, it's thinking. So it feels solid. There's one little thing I want to show you. If you didn't notice, we didn't add wire loading or anything on this slow connection. Let me make this empty so that we don't keep adding new posts. If I go to save this, it disables this button automatically. Any form element, when Livewire has wire submit on it, when the actual request is being submitted, Livewire will handle disabling any submit buttons for you. And it also adds a read-only attribute to all input elements so that the user, while it's waiting, it knows it's waiting and it can't like resubmit the form or modify the inputs or something like that. And let me show you one other step we can do to style this. So when we go to hit the save, it disables the button and it does actually mark these inputs as read-only, but it doesn't look like it. Like if we try to modify them, we can't because it is read-only, but we don't have any user feedback. So let me just show you a tip that I like to do with my forms. So let's go into show posts, or no, we want add post dialog.blade, okay? And we'll find these input elements and let's add a few classes to the ends of them. So these two input elements, if we want to make the opacity 50 just to show that they're disabled or whatever, we can use this special Tailwind pseudo selector for read-only, that when it's marked as read-only, make opacity 50. And let's do another one here. Let's say read-only cursor not allowed. And that's going to disable the cursor and show like a red or like an X symbol when we hover over it. And I actually did this on this button to show a disabled state. I added opacity 50 and cursor not allowed. I didn't tell you about it, but now I'm telling you about it. All right, so let's see this in action. Get back to a fast network, open the post, okay, and then slow the network down a bunch, type something in here. And now if we hit save, everything's disabled and our cursor is not allowed. So it feels very much like a user safe thing. It gives them, it actually prevents them from doing harmful things, and it shows them helpful loading states, UI bits that help them to just know that something's happening and that the app is working. All right, so that's kind of a little bit of a lesson in nesting components in general. That's really what it is. This doesn't have a ton to do with our modal, but this is what I would do if I were to create an entirely nested component just for a button that opens a modal on a page. So there you go. I'll see you in the next video. All right, let's do some more nesting of Livewire components. We have individual rows here. This is kind of a setup for when we're going to add like an edit button. We have these individual rows, but it's all in one Livewire component. So I already kind of talked to you about some of the drawbacks of that, where if you refresh this Livewire component, all of these modals get sent back and forth in the browser and whatever. So let's break out nested Livewire components for these rows and just talk about the strategy and how we're going to do it and whatever. So this is our show posts component where we're looping through all the posts and we have our TRs. So these are our table rows. Let's extract these into a nested component. So artisan make Livewire, we'll call it post row, and we'll let it make that component. And then let's call it right here. So post row, we're going to need to pass in the post. And if you recall, when you have the same name, you can use this shorthand syntax. So we're going to pass in the post right here. And then we'll take all this, we'll cut it, and then we'll open up post row, the Livewire component. We'll make a property called post, and then that'll get set automatically because we're passing that in there. And then inside post row blade.php, we can paste in that big TR. And yeah, so let's just see if our refactor took. All right, we refreshed and it worked. If I hit this delete button, that works, but let's just check this out. If I say confirm and then I delete, unable to call component method, public method, delete not found on component. That's because now our post row component doesn't have the delete method. Our show posts component has the delete method. So let's think about this conceptually. We could take that delete method and put it inside of the row component, and that would be fine. But what would happen is we would hit confirm. So when we open this, we would hit delete, and it would send a network request to Livewire to delete the post. Then we would have to dispatch some sort of event to refresh the list of posts to delete this row from the table. And that's very kind of similar to what we did here. We have a nested component where we add a new post, it does its own Livewire stuff, it comes back and it dispatches a refresh to the parent. And that's a fine strategy, but in this scenario, we don't actually need that intermediate step. We can just call delete. We can keep delete on the parent and just call it from this nested component. And there's a few ways to do that. I'll show you a few ways. We'll talk about it. So there's one thing we can do. Let's go to our actual close button or our delete button here. We have wire click. Oh man, the scrolling, the doom of using such nested things. We have wire click delete. This doesn't exist on this component. We can just call parent.delete if we want, and I'll show you that this works. We have some post here. We can say confirm and then hit delete. And okay, so something broke. This is a great opportunity because I missed something and I know what it is. And this is a cautionary tale. Prepare yourself. In show posts, we nested a component, right? But we didn't add a key. You've heard me blab about keys, but anytime you have a for each loop, make sure there's a key, especially if it's a Livewire nested component. If it's a Livewire nested component, it needs a key. Otherwise, bad things will happen like you just saw. We need to tell Livewire a specific unique key for each nested Livewire component in a loop. Super duper important. Okay, now we've added that. Let's delete a different one and make sure that this works. Confirm, delete. Remember we added that 1 second delay. That's why it's taking a while. Okay, so that worked. So kind of case closed. If you want to leave it at that, go for it. $parent, let's go back there and show that to you. $parent is extremely powerful. Any wire click in a nested component, you can call stuff on the parent and pass stuff to it. And it's a very nice experience. However, there's one problem with it. The problem is if you are in show posts, you don't know where delete is getting called. You don't know that it's getting called deep inside this component. So again, very powerful, but not the most transparent. So we're going to try a different strategy. Instead of calling $parent.delete, let's dispatch an event and we'll call it delete. Okay? And this is just like the same strategy we did here to say added and then refresh the whole table. So we're dispatching delete. And now let's go inside post row here. We can listen for that. I guess we want to say deleted. So let's call it deleted. Delete. Okay, let's call it deleted. So at deleted, meaning when a deleted event is dispatched from inside this component, we want to call delete. However, if you recall, inside show posts, the delete method requires a post ID. So we need to pass in a post ID. No problem. We can just echo it out simply like that. Okay. So now I like this pattern better than $parent when you can. I would say use these because it's much easier to follow and see where the dots connect. Okay. So let's delete this component. We say confirm, hit delete. It loads and then it's deleted, and that's great. And if we look at the network requests, only one was sent. So it's super efficient. It's just as efficient as anything. It's great. It's just confirm, delete, a single network request. And now when all these requests are sent back and forth, so if you have like 10 rows and this parent is refreshing itself, all of this stuff isn't going to be re-rendered and resent every time. It's so efficient. We're not bundling the entire row and all of the modals for that row with every request. So if you have 100 rows and you refresh that page or that part of that table or add a post and it needs to refresh the parent, the HTML that comes back from the server isn't this HTML times 100. It's just 100 placeholders because remember, components are islands. So when we made this a nested component, it's now an island unto itself. So this is something I'm going to keep talking about, but it's just much more efficient. So this setup, we actually just made our app more efficient without costing us anything. In this scenario, we had to now send 2 requests when you add the post, and then when you refresh the list, that's 2 requests, one to this component and then one to the parent. This, because we're just deleting it, this just calls the parent directly. So it's only 1 request. It's just as efficient as it was before, but it's actually way more efficient because we've hidden all of this inside of its own nested component so it doesn't bloat up the payload of the parent. So if you're following any of that, again, you don't have to do this stuff. All this is extra. But if you can, there's always cost with nesting Livewire components. There's complexity costs and sometimes performance costs. But if you can eat that cost, this is a scenario where it's only a win. You're just winning by doing this. So I wanted to mention it. Let's keep going. I'll see you in the next video.